for you.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Welcome to the Baker Institute. I'm very pleased to see you all here, and I'm very happy to welcome you to this special event on science diplomacy and international cooperation. The partnership represented here helps to expand the international outreach of Rice University and to realize the Baker Institute's mission of bridging the gap between the theory and practice of public policy. I would like to thank our co-sponsors for their support of this program, CRDF Global and the Partnership for a Secure America, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Science diplomacy is a method by which international collaborations are established and scientific information is shared between nations and societies whose official relations might be limited. Interactions between scientists occur naturally, during good times and bad, diplomatically speaking, and can be a means of engaging a country that otherwise would not be cooperative. By providing a platform for industrial partnerships, educational outreach, and global community development, science diplomacy creates real opportunities for civic engagement in strained political environments. So clearly, scientific collaboration is vital to meet the many challenges that we face in the 21st century, such as understanding and responding to global climate change and finding better therapies or cures for disease. While most scientists are committed to forging closer ties, practical issues of public policy sometimes stand in the way. Over the past half-century, collaborations among scientific researchers worldwide have in many cases been hindered by uneven and sometimes poor relations between governments, as well as inconsistencies in policies, standards, and practices. Successful research and the advancement of science and technology in any region of the world depends on effective, free, and open communication and cooperation among experts with specialized knowledge. Many individuals from Rice University have dedicated both their time and talent to organize this evening's event, especially the Baker Institute's Fellows in Science and Technology Policy, Drs. Neil Lane and Kirsten Matthews, who are here with us this evening. Neil and Kirsten lead the Baker Institute's Science and Technology Policy Program. Its mission is to provide a space for policymakers and scientists to engage in substantive dialogue with the hope that public policy will more accurately reflect and be more consistent with scientific knowledge. Sometimes that's proven to be a bridge too far. We are delighted to have two distinguished public servants with us this evening, Ambassador Jim Glassman and Dr. Norman Newrider. Jim Glassman worked with me on a very important public diplomacy report we did in 2003 that was congressionally mandated. And that was mandated to us also by then Secretary of State Colin Powell, Changing Minds, Winning Peace. And Jim was really my right hand on that and really put his great mind and pen to paper and had a big role in writing that report. And so I'm delighted to have Jim here. For his part, Dr. Newrider is a widely acknowledged expert in the field of science diplomacy. He's been in the field, he's been in the trenches. He was a presenter at the first event of the Science and Technology Policy Program in 2003, and we've been trying to get him back ever since. We got him back, and he just told me that he was in Karachi, so we're glad he's back. Now I would like to turn the podium over to Ms. Kathleen Campbell. Ms. Campbell is the president and CEO of CRDF Global, an independent nonprofit organization that promotes international scientific and technical collaboration through grants, technical resources, and training. CRDF Global has been involved in science diplomacy since the end of the Cold War by bringing together scientists from the former Soviet Union with American researchers. Prior to joining CRDF Global, Ms. Campbell had nearly 3 decades of international science and technology policy expertise. She has worked with and traveled extensively to countries in Eurasia, the Middle East, East Asia, and Latin America. So please join me in welcoming Ms. Campbell to the podium.
Thank you very much, Ambassador DeRugian, and it's a real pleasure for us to be here at the Baker Institute and to visit again with Neil Lane, who served on our board of directors and was instrumental in getting my organization started. My main role tonight is to serve as the moderator of the panel and to keep our speakers on time so that we have plenty of opportunity for discussion at the end of the panel, at the end of their presentations. But I'd like to begin by talking a little bit about science diplomacy. It's a term that's been difficult to define well, and the reality is that it means different things to different people. In January of 2010, the Royal Society of Britain and the AAAS suggested a framework comprised of 3 components: science in diplomacy, so referring to science input and advice for foreign policy decisions; diplomacy for science, which is diplomacy to help facilitate international science cooperation, helping with issues such as visas or access to research sites or intellectual property rights, for example; and then science for diplomacy, or using science cooperation to improve international relations. It's this third component that is most relevant to the way that I and my organization view science diplomacy. Because we're an implementing organization, we tend to be practical. And so I define science diplomacy as using science engagement to establish positive, productive, and prolonged ties between countries. Although the term's use has increased in recent years, the reality is, as we've heard earlier, that science diplomacy has been utilized and dates way back to starting engagement with the Chinese, for example, and when one of the early actions taken when we normalized relations was the development of a science and technology agreement. Certainly the experience with the Soviet Union and the Cold War engagement between scientists there was critical in terms of building the relationships and laying a foundation that was so important for pursuing a lot of different difficult issues when the Soviet Union collapsed. But a common thread in any of the examples, these 2 or others that we will hear about tonight, is the mobilization of one of America's greatest assets. It's scientists and engineers in building these long-term relationships. Mobilizing America's scientists and engineers for science diplomacy or engagement makes sense for 3 reasons. First, many of today's global challenges, food, water, energy, health, require technical solutions. Furthermore, few of today's global challenges are confined to any single country. Disease, drought, and environmental degradation know no borders. In today's flat world, they can be successfully addressed only through cross-border collaboration. Secondly, U.S. science and technology is highly respected around the world. Recent polling of citizens in Muslim-majority countries, for example, shows high regard for U.S. science and technology leadership. By building on this perception and the interest in collaboration, the U.S. can significantly expand opportunities for engagement. And third, scientists and engineers speak a common language that transcends political, cultural, and economic boundaries. Whether working in the United States, Egypt, or Indonesia, scientists understand and apply the same scientific formulas and principles. A scientist's ability to forge new pathways of collaboration, often despite difficult political environments, is a valuable tool for diplomacy. And as we have seen around the world, when science and technology flourishes, so do economies. For science diplomacy to succeed, we must continue to educate the international research community, policymakers, and the public about its importance. This is what we are doing with events like today's discussion and other events, similar events that we held recently in New York at the Council on Foreign Relations, at a launch event in Washington, and then out on the West Coast in Palo Alto. This is all part of the partnership that we have formed with the AAAS and with a Partnership for Secure America in raising the visibility and awareness of the importance of science diplomacy. So to speak a little more about that, I'm pleased to introduce our colleague Kathy Glockle, representing the Partnership for Secure America.
Good evening. First, I'd like to say thank you to everyone for coming tonight. We really appreciate it, and it's great to be back in Houston. I actually went to school in Louisiana and haven't been back in 20 years, so finally had some good Mexican food after being in D.C. for a couple of years. I'd like to start first off by thanking Kathy, everybody at CRDF who've helped with us, everyone at the Baker Center. It's my first visit. It's beautiful, so thank you to the ambassador, to Neil Lane, to Kirsten, and also to Melissa, who did a tremendous job in putting this together for us. I'd also like to thank our panelists, Ambassador Glassman and Dr. Newrider, who have both worked with us on this, and to come out from Washington or down from Dallas, wherever you were, we really appreciate it. And also our partner, AAAS, because they funded this. So you always have to remember the funders. And finally, I have to thank my own staff member, Alexis, who's in the back, because I've only been here for 5 months, so she's been keeping me on track on this whole initiative. And so I'd like to just say a few words about the partnership. You might not have heard of us. We're only about 5 years old. We were actually formed to work on bipartisan policy issues. We were formed by, Warren Redmond and Lee Hamilton. They were very concerned about the partisanship in Washington and elsewhere, so they put their names behind this new organization, and they put together an incredible advisory board. And if you look outside when you walked in, you'll see former secretaries of state, secretaries of defense, a governor, et cetera, who have backed us. And we pick issues like this because we feel that they're critical to the American public, the business sector, the private sector, the public sector, and they also show America at its best. So we try to go out and do statements, we do outreach events, and we also do events in Washington. And this is why we're here supporting this tonight. So thank you very much.
Okay, so it's my honor to introduce our first speaker, Ambassador James Glassman, whose career has spanned journalism, business, academia, and diplomacy. He is a recognized expert on economics, technology, and public policy, and has written and spoken on these areas to audiences around the world. As the founding director of the George W. Bush Institute at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, he has demonstrated skill as a communicator. Since February 2010, he has moderated Ideas in Action, a weekly series on public policy issues aired on more than 100 public television stations around the country. He joins us this evening to share his insights on the issue of diplomacy through science. Ambassador Glassman.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, both Kathys. And it's a great honor to be here at the Baker Institute. You know, Ambassador Dirigian, and he mentioned this in passing, but I want to say it more forcefully, is the guy who got me into the public diplomacy racket, and so he's personally responsible. I am following in his footsteps in public diplomacy as well as in the business of running a think tank. And I now head the George W. Bush Institute in Dallas, where we focus on 4 issues: education reform, global health, economic growth, and human freedom, which has relevance to what we're going to be talking about tonight. And it's also a great honor to share the platform with Norm Newrider, who's a legend in this area. And I'm going to talk tonight mostly about public diplomacy. I know Kathy talked about the many definitions of science diplomacy and ended up saying that science for diplomacy is where she wants to focus. And what I'm going to do is something pretty similar. I want to talk about public diplomacy and where science fits into public diplomacy. We live in a turbulent time. I don't have to tell you that. No one knows where the rebellions in the Middle East will turn out, but we are seeing a profound change in Libya, in Egypt, throughout the Middle East, and I suspect eventually in Syria and Iran as well. I also suspect that we're seeing an upheaval that matches the period from 1776 to 1848, when revolutions swept America and then France and then Latin America and then much of the rest of Europe. And it's no coincidence that the political and human rights revolutions of the late 18th century and the early 19th century coincided with the scientific revolution, as manifested in what we call the Industrial Revolution of the same time. There is a tight relationship between the values of science and the values of political freedom. Both, of course, are rooted in the Enlightenment. Franklin and Jefferson were scientists, I guess amateur scientists. Washington was almost a scientist. He was a surveyor, and certainly I think you'd call him a scientific farmer. But what do science and political freedom have in common? In his book, Science and Human Values, Jacob Bronowski, the late Polish-British mathematician, wrote, "Truth is the drive at the center of science. It must have the habit of truth, not as a dogma, but as a process. Consider then step by step what kind of society scientists have been compelled to form in this single pursuit. If truth is to be found, not given, and if therefore it is to be tested in action, what other conditions and with them what other values grow of themselves from this?" So then he lists those values. Independence, originality, and dissent. Those are the values that he lists. And I think those are all values that are deeply at odds with authoritarianism. Bronowski says that the habit of truth is at the heart of science. And so is the habit, I would say, of tolerance, of equality of opportunity. One does not prove a scientific hypothesis by virtue of one's social status, or wealth, or tribe, or political connections. So now, I ask you just to hold on to this thought. Science and political liberty are closely connected. Because I want to turn now to public diplomacy and then come back to science and its place in the practice of public diplomacy. Here's the best definition of public diplomacy. Understand, and bear with me, because it's long. Understanding, engaging, informing, and influencing foreign publics with the goal of achieving the national interests of the United States. And of the four activities that I named, the most important, I have no doubt, is influencing. Public diplomacy is a means, not an end. It is a particular set of tools and approaches that help us influence foreign publics in order to achieve goals that the United States desired. And during the George W. Bush administration, the relevant goals were keeping the United States safe and promoting freedom. Goals that, in President Bush's mind, are linked. Free people tend not to make war on their neighbors. They tend not to threaten the world with weapons of mass destruction. So it makes us safer when people are freer. Joseph Nye, the Harvard political scientist who coined the phrase soft power, offers a good way to categorize the work of public diplomacy in temporal terms. So there are short-term efforts, such as the work of Voice of America and other elements of U.S. international broadcasting, which I had the honor to chair, or the efforts of the State Department's Public Affairs Office to correct the record and explain U.S. policy. And here a nod to Ambassador Dirigian, whose idea it was, and Karen Hughes picked him up on this, to start what's called the Rapid Response Unit in the State Department. So this is to correct mistakes that the foreign press often makes about United States policy or explain U.S. policy. So that's the short-term efforts. Then there are medium-term efforts, for example, achieving specific policy ends in 6 months to a few years. And I have to say this is where I concentrated during my time as Undersecretary. For example, trying to influence Pakistani publics to recognize that they were faced and are faced with an existential threat from violent extremism, something that most elements of the Pakistani public a few years ago did not believe that they faced, and many still don't. And there are long-term efforts, which is where most of U.S. taxpayer money goes. For example, educational exchanges that expose key foreigners to values of tolerance and opportunity and political freedom. Now, I came to the conclusion when I was undersecretary that the best way to perform all these acts of communication is through something that I christened public diplomacy 2.0. There's so many 2.0s now that I kind of embarrassed that I came up with this particular moniker. But anyway, public diplomacy 2.0. In the past, our favored method of communication was often getting up on a pulpit, like I'm doing right now, and preaching. That is, standing in one place and broadcasting your voice. But audiences today, especially, do not take kindly to this approach, but I thank you for taking kindly to it, at least for now. We'll have some interaction later. But a better way to communicate is through the generation of a wide and deep conversation. The U.S. government role in that conversation is as facilitator and convener. We generate the conversation in the belief that our views will be heard, even if government actors are not always the authors of those views. So we want to be part of a conversation. And the good thing is that this new approach, this public diplomacy 2.0 approach, which the Obama administration has picked up on and really expanded, and I'm very pleased, it takes advantage of new social networking technologies like Facebook and YouTube and Second Life, whose essence is multiple simultaneous conversations in words and pictures. And by the way, here, science helps. In a way, science promotes what I believe to be the best kind of diplomacy. And in fact, the method of communication itself is a reflection of American values. The medium, as Marshall McLuhan said, and I know I'm simplifying all you McLuhanites out there, I know I'm simplifying Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message. That's the point. So we as Americans do not dictate. Rather, we believe in a free and open discussion. And the best ideas in such a discussion will prevail, and we want to encourage the free expression of views rather than drowning out words that disturb us. So let me quote Joe Nye again. If I am persuaded to go along with your purposes without any explicit threat or exchange taking place, in short, if my behavior is determined by observable but intangible attraction, soft power is at work. Soft power uses a different type of currency, not force, not money, to engender cooperation, an attraction to shared values and the justness and duty of contributing to the achievement of those values. An attraction to shared values, that's the key phrase here. And I would add that sometimes we have to actually promote values that others do not know that they share. And you'll notice that in none of this discussion of public diplomacy do I say that its aim is to make people like us. Now, certainly, if the objective of public diplomacy is to influence foreigners in the pursuit of specific policy aims, then if those foreigners are predisposed to love America, to the extent that they'll embrace whatever we say, then likability or lovability is a decent pursuit. But getting people to like a superpower is not easy. Nor, frankly, is it necessary to achieve one's aims. In fact, my main complaint about the way public diplomacy is practiced is that striving for likability is often the default position. I also believe that there's too much talk in public diplomacy about us, about the United States, and not about others. It's not about us. That was my main complaint, in fact, about President Obama's Cairo speech, much of which was very good. But part of his thrust was that you're going to like us in the United States a whole lot better now that we have a new president. It hasn't quite turned out to be true, but that's not the point. I think that Egyptians wanted to hear what he thought about Egypt, especially about the authoritarian regime under which they were living. The president did use a great phrase in his speech and in his inaugural address: mutual interest and mutual respect. I think that is a terrific slogan for public diplomacy and for foreign policy in general. To reach our aims, We need to find those areas where we are aiming at the same goals. One great example, of course, is fighting terrorism, where Muslim nations are even more vulnerable than we are. We share a common interest there and work together as public diplomacy 2.0 prescribes. But it's more than mutual interests. As Joe Nye says, it's shared values. And that's how we get back to science. If our goals in foreign policy are to make America safe by promoting political freedom, then we want foreign people to embrace the values of free societies, of free inquiry, of free markets, tolerance, equal rights for women. Science, I strongly believe, is a means to those ends. In fact, a very non-threatening means to those ends. And it's important in cooperation to find ways that we can cooperate that are non-threatening. And science is certainly one of those. Another, by the way, is teaching English, which we do in public diplomacy to great effect. As Ambassador Dirigian and his co-authors point out in their excellent op-ed piece that appeared in the Houston Chronicle, there is an enormous respect for U.S. science around the world, and it is a great connector. As Ambassador Dirigian and his co-authors write, the very nature of scientific investigation encourages interactions between researchers regardless of where they happen to live and work. And I think that's a tremendously important point. I can give some examples in recent years of this kind of cooperation through public diplomacy. The International Fulbright Science and Technology Award, which supports doctoral study for foreigners in the U.S. Fulbright, in the United States. And Fulbright also has specialist programs for U.S. scientists who are working abroad. A women's science conference in Kuwait in 2007, co-sponsored by the AAAS. And here's what Undersecretary of State Paula Dobriansky said about that. It is in all of our interests, men and women in the public and private sectors, to encourage women to study science, engineering, and mathematics, and to pursue careers in those fields. We can help by building strong science networks, seeking out public-private partnership opportunities, promoting women's leadership and mentoring roles, and increasing access to science education for youth, especially for girls. Science diplomacy tends to fit on the long-term end of the public diplomacy spectrum, which means that its effects are hard to judge because they take a while and they can't be isolated easily. But science diplomacy is tremendously important in reaching our overall strategic goals in this country of freedom and security. Science diplomacy deserves to be not just respected, but increased, to be much more important in our nation's lives and in the lives of people around the world. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Norm Newrider, who actually has some roots here in Texas. He has a tremendous wealth of experience working in the private sector, has a science background and chemistry, and has worked very actively in the general area of science cooperation, and then more recently to really help focus and make some advancements in the world of science diplomacy. He was the first science and technology advisor to the Secretary of State, and in my view, and I know the view of many people, he set the bar really, really high for that position. So, Norm?
Thanks so much, Kathy. It's really, really great to be here. Wonderful to be here at the Center again. I started my science career out there in Baytown, right, at the Humble Oil Refinery. That's a long time ago, but it's good to be back here. Nothing important. What is science diplomacy? Now, Kathy said it can mean quite a number of things to different people and so on, and you've tied it very well to public diplomacy, of which it can be a part. But my definition is this, and it's important because that's what I'm going to talk about, and that's what I'm really concentrating on these days and what I've done a lot of in the past 50 years, it seems. The use of science cooperation as a means of active engagement with countries where overall relations are strained or non-existent. In other words, it's an instrument of a constructive foreign policy aimed at mutually beneficial engagement. The science has to be of good quality, but the underlying motivation for it is not scientific, it's foreign policy driven. I'll come to general international science and cooperation right at the very end. But this is different. This is a special kind of thing. Most international S&T cooperation is science-driven, and it also can be a part of development aid. Now, I'm throwing this in for you, Jim, because this is 1959, and this is Moscow, and my wife and I both worked at the American National Exhibition in Moscow. I was a guide, and she passed out Pepsi Cola to thirsty Russians. But this was really one of the great public diplomacy initiatives. And Sapphire talked about this at the 50th reunion of all of these guides a couple of years ago, and reminded us of this picture in which he had some involvement. And this is then Vice President Nixon shaking his finger at Nikita Khrushchev and trying to explain that, yes, American workers can live in a model house of this kind. And he came back and said, well, of course, Russians do too. Anyway, and when we were showing television, we were showing American technology applied to the consumer world in the United States. So it was a kind of science diplomacy, even at that time. This is President Kennedy's ambassador to Japan, Edwin Reischauer, professor at Harvard, great expert on Japan. And what he perceived in 1960 was the broken dialogue between the intellectual communities of the two countries. He wrote an article for Foreign Affairs, so impressed the president that he appointed him as his ambassador to Japan. And at the first state visit of Prime Minister Ikeda to Washington, President Kennedy got up and made a toast. And the toast was that we need to do something to fix the broken dialogue between our intellectual communities. And he proposed 3 committees: a cabinet-level committee on economics, a cultural committee involving university people, and finally, for the first time in American diplomatic history, a joint committee on scientific cooperation between the US and Japan. I just happened to, here, that was President Kennedy before, here's Jackie with the Prime Minister, and Lyndon Johnson actually followed up 2 years later by proposing a medical and health cooperative relationship with Japan. Both of those programs actually still exist today. That was my first job in government, was running that program at the National Science Foundation way back in 1963. Nixon and Kissinger really were doing science diplomacy in a very vigorous way. And I will also tell you, and I'm sure you'll confirm this, Ed, this was the period of best coordinated foreign policy that we ever had. And they were particularly outstanding in the examples of China and Russia. I had gone to work in the White House Office of Science and Technology in that time. And the reason I call this personal recollections and reflections is that I was very involved in each one of these things. And this was fascinating. Henry Kissinger came to my boss, the President's science advisor, one day, just as they were preparing the trip to China, the breakthrough trip to China. And he said, look, I'd like to give the Chinese, or convince the Chinese, that there's something more concrete than just a geopolitical repositioning in the relationship between our countries. So think of some science initiatives that we can take with us. And so it was Ed David at the time, and he said, Norman, go think up some science initiatives that we can take to China. Well, but don't tell anybody, because it is a huge secret. No one must know about this trip. Anyway, we managed to cobble together about 40 initiatives. They did go to China. They were part of the discussions. And if you read that famous Shanghai communique, you will see that science was one of the areas which was mentioned where we might eventually have some cooperation. And indeed, that did come to pass. Here was the banquet where they were eating together in Beijing. And then when diplomatic relations were established in 1979, as you, Kathy, said at the beginning, there in fact was a science agreement signed between the countries. And since then, the relationship with China in science has turned out to be one of the biggest cooperative relationships we have with any country. That is actually not pleasant to some people, and perhaps we can talk about that in the discussion period. Deng Xiaoping came to Texas at that time, and here he got his he got his hat when he was in town. I think he came to Houston at the time, did he not? Yeah. Now the Russia issue. It's not only governments who can do science diplomacy, but scientists among themselves. And those people who built nuclear weapons during the war, both the Russians, both the Soviets and the Americans the scientists realized that if we ever had a nuclear exchange between us, and there were 35,000 weapons on each side pointed at each other during those years, if there ever had been a full nuclear exchange between us, civilization, in fact, might not exist on the earth today. So these people realized that, and they began a dialogue at a little town in Nova Scotia called Pugwash, and that's why these conferences were called Pugwash. There's a great history to that group. Here was their first meeting in 1957. But those conversations began to percolate up in the system and came to the attention of governments. And so what you had there was a transition from conversations among scientists to track 2 negotiations. In other words, they were done by non-government people, but it's called track 2 now, where non-government people really discuss serious diplomatic issues between the countries, and eventually this led to the signing of the Limited Test Ban Treaty by President Kennedy in I think 1963. Well, this was the initiative in 1972, and again, President Nixon had said to my boss, who at that time was Lee Dubridge, he said, we ought to do, this was before 72, it was earlier. He said, we ought to do something with Russia. Think about something with Russia. So we put together a committee, and we did come up with some things. And actually at the Nixon-Brezhnev summit in 1972, just a month and a half after the breakthrough with China, came this summit, and there were 7 science agreements signed at that time. One of them, the Space Docking Agreement. Now you can imagine, the opposition in the United States to having a docking agreement with the Soviet Union. Well, it's sort of lucky today because the only transport now to the International Space Station is by, a Russian capsule, and furthermore, there are Russian docking ports on the International Space Station. Here was where they signed some of the agreements. Here were the 2 of them getting together. That looks to me like it was on the river in Moscow. And now we get to the present day and some things that we've been involved in at AAAS and at our Academy of Sciences. These, not to offend anyone, but you're now going to hear about the 5 bad countries that I happen to be concentrating on. Iran. I would describe our relationship with Iran as quite bad. But in fact, over the past 10 years, the Academy, and I've been involved in 2 of them, I guess altogether it's 4, but only 2 in Iran. Our Academy has had about 20 workshops with their science community. Iran is in fact very good in science. They're second only to Turkey among the Muslim countries, and there's some very good people there. They also aren't completely in sympathy with their government. Here we are. That man on the right happens to be, or at that time, he doesn't have his job anymore. There have been several in that job since then. He was the man in charge of technology in the office of the presidency. There are my wife and I at a tea house having lunch. This was in 2004. And it was a different country in 2004. And I truthfully believe that if there had been a better response in 2003 on our part, we could have had some kind of a deal with Iran. That was passed up and relations have gotten steadily worse. Khatami, the reformist president at the time, of course, was shortly out after that. We have a very different regime today. This is 2007. Dr. Taylor, the Tolman standing in the middle, is a physicist, a Nobel Prize winning physicist from Princeton University. And he led a group of about 8 of us. And there we are at sort of the MIT of Iran. That's the Sharif University in Tehran. The president is the man next to him, Professor Sarabpour. Sarabpour was the longest standing president of a university in Iran, and he was just replaced a month ago. You would have to be a president of a university in Iran now, you have to agree to the principles handed down by President Ahmadinejad. It is a very repressive, unpleasant system at the present time. But he went all over. His speech was broadcast over an intranet throughout the country to all the universities. That auditorium was packed. It was huge. It was a huge hit. He was treated like a movie star. There's also a series of science parks in Iran where young people, young engineers who want to be entrepreneurs and start their own businesses can go and work. And we visited one. Pardis actually means paradise in Farsi. And we visited this science park, and it is a very big deal, and there were some fine young people there. And the first thing they wanted to do was to have Joe Taylor go out in front and pose for a statue that would be built of him over the coming year. And by golly, they did take his measurements. It turns out they had to wait a while because there had to be a mullah's statue put someplace nearby. But anyway, it was done, and it was unveiled a year later, and there is that statue. So there's a very warm feeling of the science community of Iran toward Americans, and hopefully we can continue to sustain that. Even since the election, which was so negative, I shouldn't have jumped to this one. But anyway, since the election, which was so negative this last time and clearly fraudulent, we actually have had 3 seminars. There's one more working. One was solar energy, one was on earthquakes, and one was on urban transportation. We try to pick non-sensitive subjects where there can be some benefit to both sides. Now, if you think relations with Iran are bad, pick this one, North Korean. They're really bad with North Korea, right? But you know something about that here at Rice University because Professor Gillis has been instrumental in the creation of this particular university, Pyongyang University of Science and Technology. And through a South Korean, I was invited to attend the dedication of this institution, which was September a year ago. And I really couldn't believe it. It's 17 buildings, $34 million contributed by volunteers from South Korea, and largely Koreans living elsewhere in the world, many in the United States. And this one man, Dr. James Kim, has been behind it. He'd built a university of this kind in China, in the Korean Autonomous District of China. And he did it for the poor Chinese people there, started as schools and then became a university. There's a 500-mile border between the two countries. The North Koreans wandered over, looked at it and said, hey, maybe you could build one of those for us. And he says, sure. And actually, when he started going there, they arrested him for spying. He sat in jail for 45 days. On the 45th day, they came to him and said, you're being executed tomorrow morning for spying, so please write your will. And he wrote, being of sound body and mind, I herewith donate my body and my organs to the people of North Korea. This is really true. I mean, this is hard to believe. This is really true. Well, that message got to the top guy. And he says, ooh, that's our kind of guy. He was given reprieve. He was given reprieve. He now travels freely between the two countries. He has a permanent visa, and he has built this institution. They did find, here was a dedication. There were tears in his eyes as he was officially made by the Vice Minister of Education of North Korea as he was given this document, making him the operating president of this new institution. There they are, bowing to each other and clapping as it happened. And he's taken over. They did finally open. It was day 5 to go. Okay, I'll make it. They opened last October they plan to go to 2,000 students. They began last October. All instruction is in English. They have 160 students at this time. They hope to expand in March. It's only English teaching so far, but they hope to start the scientific curriculum. And I actually met in South Korea with the Academic Advisory Board, and they've worked out a really nice scientific curriculum. It will just be amazing if this thing goes over. And by the way, if some of you would like to teach, you have to volunteer. You don't get paid, but you do get room and board. If you would like to teach there, they are taking volunteers at the present time. This was the group of the dedication saying farewell. Syria. Your director here is an expert on Syria, so he knows much more about it than I do. But we had quite an incredible visit, which was financed by the very wealthy Syrian who gave Oxford University its business school. Right? He took us there, flew us there in his own private 737. And we spent a lot of time with the university. We talked about some things. We hope to get some projects going in energy and water and agriculture were the three areas that were suggested. This is not me. This is actually George Mitchell, but we have the same hairdo. He met us exactly the same way as we walked into his office, and so I thought it was an appropriate person. We had a nice visit with him, as I told you. And actually when he said, we would like to do some science with you, we would like to get more science into our universities and our companies, but I have a bureaucracy to work through, so we'll see. We'll see what happens. Certainly the news from Syria is very bad today. This was a recent visit of me about 3 months ago, and that was on the website of the Syrian Ministry of Higher Education. And actually, if you look tonight at the website, I think you'll see a picture of Ambassador, the American ambassador to Syria, Robert Ford, in those same chairs with a discussion. Cuba, the Cuban policy has been frozen for 50 years. They would like very much to cooperate with us. I haven't been yet. Our people have made 2 visits there, but it's difficult. There's so many restrictions, it will be difficult. But interestingly, despite these restrictions, you can go and discuss research. That's allowed, and you don't need a special license to do it. Our final one is Burma, or Myanmar as it's known today. We made 1 trip there. We had a Nobel Prize winner with us, Peter Agre, a biological scientist, a specialist in malaria. There we are at the Ministry of Health. Here we are at the Ministry of Forestry. I think there's something we could do there in environmental work, in malaria work. It's a poor country. There are scenes of an orphanage with the children. But you know, it's an isolated country. The generals don't want contact with the rest of the world. But we'll see what happens there. That's going to move very slowly. The latest big thing from the president was his Cairo speech, reaching out to science in the Muslim world, or out with science to the Muslim world. The first thing they did was to send envoys around. And the intention really is to try to move toward a serious long-term program on a partnership basis. And Kathy's organization, CRDF, will have a key role in that, and maybe we at AAAS will. But certainly what's going on in the Middle East today is a big issue. I was just in Pakistan, and there's so many issues and problems there. There are people who would like to cooperate with this. It may be possible, but there are lots of issues. And unfortunately, there's an air of disappointment because that trip was in June of 2009. Not much has happened except visits. Even in Pakistan, they said, where's the beef? Where's it going to happen? Where's the program? Same thing even in Egypt, they've been saying. There's an air of disappointment about it. What lessons have we learned from all this? Well, science does permit easy communication. It opens doors to influential people. It is possible to do something. It can become track 2 meetings. Inevitably, and this is important, there is opposition in the United States. There's home opposition against engaging in science with hostile countries. And that's something you just got to face up to and deal with. So these are the challenges. You've got to deal with the criticism. It's easy to make the first visit, but it's really hard to build a sustainable program and find things. There's some problems with money, but they aren't very good cooperators on the other side because they have political problems if they get too close to any American. But just as Kathy said, you've got to persevere and you've got to sustain if you want to do this. This is my final point. It's a little different. And you made the point, Kathy, at the beginning in a way you beefed it up from a public diplomacy angle. But it's very clear that the global science community must cooperate to address the great challenges that face humanity: climate change, environmental protection, natural disasters, food, water, health, energy, and so on. And we actually see an important role for associations like ours, AAAS, CRDF, as well as universities, to work toward a coherence or a kind of harmonization within this global science community of the standards and norms for the practice and ethics of science. That's a great challenge for all of us. Thanks a lot.
So now we will have an opportunity for discussion and questions.
Thanks.
Are there any questions from the
I just-
floor? I
I
would
just
just
had to
ask
show
you
that
to
crucial.
please identify yourself before asking your question, and if you are directing it to one or both of the panelists. Please, sir.
My name is Carlos Ordóñez, and to both of you. Most of the emphasis on science as diplomacy, of diplomacy through science, seems to have been on the issues of security, disasters, peace, and all of that is fantastic, and they have been good payoffs, for sure. So we have to thank all of you who have been working hard on that. But there's also another angle, which is the angle of opportunities, in particular in Latin America. I think that the traditional antagonism seems to be slowing down, and there seems to be some opportunities to increase relationships between that part of the world and us, more of an angle, a sort of positive angle, more than the negative, trying to make friends and so forth. And with the idea of exchanging science and technology for the benefit of both sides to create opportunities, development, etc. So, is this something that in the current thinking of the policymakers that is of the importance or of interest? It seems that President Obama is pushing for that, but I'd like to see sort of.
Absolutely. Remember what I was trying to do. I was trying to show science diplomacy, which I define as focusing on countries where relations are bad. But last summer I was in Brazil and attended their big national conference, the fourth annual conference of science and technology for all of Brazil. 4,000 scientists there. I was asked to give a speech. No, there are tremendous opportunities in Brazil for cooperation. There is a cooperative program which has been going for 15 years or more with Mexico. They can always use more money, and it's difficult to find enough money to do things. But those programs are built on true mutual scientific interest, and they're science-driven. It's nice to do them for political reasons also, but it's driven by the science and the mutual opportunity which exists from that. And that's why I said at the end, that's so important. And we need to get universal standards and ethics for the practice of science throughout the world. And then we need to start working on all these big issues, from energy to environment and so on. But I'm glad you mentioned it, because that is a very important part of our international scientific agenda. But to me, that's not science diplomacy, though to some people it is, and I don't really mind.
I really don't have anything to add except to say that I think that in the past few years, the changes in Latin America have been profound and very, very positive. And I was in Colombia when I was undersecretary. I was recently in Peru, and I think that the United States is not paying enough attention to the changes that are happening in Latin America. And I think, while there are problems, I think in general the changes are quite positive. I think if you look, by the way, in another life, I write about investing, and if you look at the area of the world that has done the best in the last 10 years, and with its stock market, that it is Latin America. And that's telling you something.
This is regarding climate change. I think that presents a great opportunity to initiate some sort of international collaboration and start discussing scientific solutions whereby you can create sustainable remediation of climate change. And in my opinion, it begins at the interface where biotechnology meets atmospheric chemistry, meets industrial production. And therefore, I think and this is a long-term solution, on the order of a couple of centuries, I think that this is a great model for creating carbon negative technologies and therefore incorporating an economically sustainable plan for the remediation of climate change. Not only sustainable, but profitable. That's
A couple of points to make on that. I mean, really the climate change issue is a global issue, and it's been treated globally. I mean, it began with Kyoto. They don't have a global agreement. It's really very, very firm now, but there has been progress. Secondly, the fact that 1,500 scientists cooperated in creating this IPCC report, the International Panel on Climate Change, is a pretty remarkable thing. Few people disagree with it, but the vast majority of people believe it's correct. It's been reviewed by our Academy of Sciences. So there really is an international effort in that. Now, a lot of the current plan of the U.S. in the Department of Energy, in fact, is focused just on reducing the carbon footprint of our energy system. And there are a lot of pieces to that. Up until 2 weeks ago, nuclear was a part of that, and I trust it still will be, but it's the Japanese incident has hurt it a lot. Anyway, what you're saying is exactly right, and there's a lot of work going on, and there are a lot of international meetings and cooperation on this subject, but you make a very important point.
If I may, what I'm referring to is in mechanized or industrialized biosequestration of greenhouse gases on a large scale, coupling that with industrial production of substrates for all kinds of goods like textiles and building materials, that not only is a step up from the carbon neutral of biofuels into locking some of these greenhouse gases, not only CO2, but methane, into long biopolymers that can be recycled into durable goods that lock these gases up. And of course, in tandem with advances of a maturing alternative energy industry, as far as I know, there hasn't been any large-scale collaboration either here in the United States or with other countries. And I think this is a great opportunity for creating a new bioeconomy for this 21st century and the 22nd century. That's pretty much what I'm referring to. And I think the IPCC has done some great work. That's the foundation upon which we can.
No, there's a lot still to do. Good suggestion.
Other questions, please.
My name is Mark Harrington. I'm an immigration lawyer, and a lot of my clients are researchers.
Really?
One of the things
From India? From India?
Yeah. One of the things I'm always worried about is what happens when all the researchers want to go somewhere else. When they want to start, if they ever stop coming to the United States, we're in trouble. Can both of you talk, in terms of science diplomacy, how does the United States compare to other countries? What other countries are doing in terms of science diplomacy? And perhaps you could talk about what some of the other countries are doing in terms of these countries where our relationship isn't all that great.
Let's take the broad definition of science diplomacy, which is really international science cooperation. Every country is doing that. India has 84 science agreements cooperation agreements with 84 other countries. right? We have officially, I think, what is it now, Kathy, 45 or something, formal science agreements with other countries. Funding is always a problem in making it work, but a lot of people realize that these are broad global challenges, the problems that were listed up here. And we need to work on them together, and we can complement each other. We don't have to compete with each other. Now, you say, what about if all the people go other ways? Well, frankly, our visa the visa problems here are really a barrier. And it's hard to get factual data, but I've had university professors tell me that they feel they're not always getting the best and the brightest anymore. And 20 years ago, the best and the brightest only wanted to come to the United States. But now they can go to Germany, they can go to France, they can go to the UK, they can go to Japan, and they can also go to China. And from some countries they are going, and the Chinese welcome them and they like to have them come in. Anyway, the visa problem is an issue. We have some export control issues which also limit the thing. We need to continue to be attractive to these other people. Interestingly, many of the people who trained here are now being recruited back home, both to India and China. And I still remember being in a meeting at the Academy of Sciences, and a man got up in the audience and he said, I studied in America, I was here for 20 years, and I went back to China, and you know, the laboratory they offered me there is better than the one in the United States, plus the salary, plus a place to live. I'm going to go and stay. No, we have a challenge in the world, and we have to meet that. But interestingly, we also need to cooperate with people in the other countries. You'll find industries way ahead of us on this. Industry looks on the world as a single market, which they have to deal with country by country, but they see it as a single market, and the global science community faces a common challenge.
Let me answer this question in the context of my interest in public diplomacy. So that as far as public diplomacy is concerned, as I said earlier, the most important thing we do, or the area where we spend most of our money, is on exchanges, on educational exchanges. And the United States has more foreign students matriculating in higher education than any other country in the world, over 600,000. There was a decline after 9/11, but it came right back up. And but the world has become much more competitive in this area, and that's, by the way, I think a good thing. I think it's good that China now has places for great scientists to do great work, but our immigration policy is really counterproductive. We are chasing the best and the brightest away from the United States. Now, they're being drawn there because their home countries are doing a better job, they're becoming wealthier, and that's fine. But we're also chasing them away. And I really think that that part of the solution to the economic problems that we have in the United States is a smarter immigration policy, and we need that.
Neil.
Neil Lane, I live here. One of the delights of working on a campus, this one or any of the others around the country, is to work with young people. And we find young people increasingly interested in scientists and other fields, increasingly interested in policy issues. So my question, both in public diplomacy and science diplomacy, is what's in it for the young?
We had an interesting conversation with some of the young people that you refer to earlier, and I think that Norm and I both agreed that we wanted them to run for Congress because there are not enough scientists in Congress. Well, I have to say, I just think these issues involving science and public policy in general are among the most important and the most fascinating that we face. Back in the late 1990s, I moderated a TV show called Technopolitics on PBS. That was a weekly show that looked at exactly at these issues, and we had no shortage of topics to discuss. So these are very interesting subjects, and one of the question, an important question is, can you do science and public policy without a science background? And I think the answer is you can, but it's important to have that science background. So I think these two fields together become probably one of the most important things we can be doing in America today.
As you know, Neil, we have the AAAS Fellows Program, and where PhDs who would like to get some policy experience can apply, a very competitive process. And this year we had something like 200, right? Well, many more applicants, but something between 160 and 200 will be placed in 12 different agencies of the government. And that is a terrific program, and as you look back, it's been going for 30 years, but it's grown explosively in the last few years. And if you look at where they go, about a third go back to their universities or wherever they came from, about a third stay in government, and then a third go someplace else. And so what's fascinating is you have kind of a science policy mafia now, which is spread very effectively through the agencies, and it's a wonderful network for people who come in. So I think they're fascinating opportunities to get a taste of policy and then to make the right decision for you and your career.
And I just have to add quickly, because we have a lot of young people that work at my organization, and I'm the mother of kids in their 20s who constantly remind me that we haven't done a very good job. If you take a look at the state of the world right now and how eager they are to really make a difference. And so what I tell the young people, we need you because you really do have an opportunity to come up with new ideas and to inform the policy world in a way that that is based on the experience that you have. I think young people today are much more global in their outlook. They're certainly far more technology savvy. And I think your energy and your ideas are very much needed.
I had a year as a Fulbright student in Germany, and I've sort of never gotten over it. That had more impact on my future life than anything else. I recommend that every young person try to get a year abroad during your studies.
Absolutely. Yes.
My name is David Alexander. I'm a professor here in physics and astronomy, and in the last year or so I've had a lot of interaction in Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, and working with people in both science centres and at universities. One of the things and the question I have is it's fairly easy, well, I mean, once you go over some of these hurdles, to talk at a high level with vice presidents of universities and various members of the government. But it's a sustainability thing that I'm worried about in some of the things that we're trying to do. You have to, the infrastructure for some of these countries is not there in terms of educating K through 12 and beyond, even though they'll buy a nanotechnology centre, a medical centre, a new lab for this, that, and the next thing, 10 telescopes. So how do you balance that in the stuff that you're doing between getting the diplomacy in with the right people at the top, but making sure that the benefits are long-lasting by educating the very youngest?
Kathy, why don't you answer that? You work in so many countries, have been doing this a long time.
Well, but we don't work K through 12, so I really can't address that particular issue, although I know it's extremely important. But we do work at the university level and certainly postdocs and such. And I think the more and the earlier you can start with people and build that experience of being able to work collaboratively, the better and the more chance of success you're going to have in building the long-term framework. But I agree 100%. You have to go into it with a long-term view. It takes years and years to build the kind of relationships.
That was the one point I wanted to make to it. You just really have to persevere because you're dealing with a different political situation. You're dealing with places where change can come and come suddenly and unpleasantly. Funding can fall apart on both sides. All kinds of things happen. If you aren't in it for the long haul, if you don't want to really carry this on because you believe in it and you know it's the right way for the world to go and for us to go, if you don't have that commitment for the long term, it can be a real problem. You just have to keep persevering.
I mean, just on that, I mean, one of the things, like I said, is they want to talk, they love American science, and they want to talk to you, they want to bring you in, and they want you to give the talks, and they want to show that they're working with you, and they want to
get some ideas, but they always want to come in the master's program, help us develop a master's program in science or something. But how do we go about making sure that we can't go into the K-12 necessarily, but we can actually try and encourage that infrastructure to be built. Otherwise, 4 years, even if you persevere, all they've got is a master's program with 3 people coming through it because they're not producing the right caliber of people to go into those programs. And that's just, I know I'm just starting this, but this is 20 years from now, and I'm just wondering.
No, you have to talk about it. I mean, you talk about it with them, and you have to remind them that they need to do something with the schools. I think just by continuing to talk about it, giving them opportunities to come here and see how the system works and so on, or doesn't work.
Well, actually, I think that's a really good point. The part about it doesn't work is that there's some promising developments that I know about because we do, the Bush Institute is deeply involved in K-12 education in the United States, but there are promising developments that I know about in Kuwait and Qatar, for example, where they are kind of leapfrogging, just as they have in telecommunications and in Africa, over some of the legacy problems that we have. So in some ways, certainly they're not in a great position in most of these countries, but I really have some I think they're promising developments, and I actually think that there's a chance for a great deal of accomplishment. The other thing I would say is you can't do everything, and so while K-12 education is really important, that to be working at higher levels is also important. And so I just don't want anybody to feel like they're letting anyone down by just working at the higher levels.
So we need to conclude in about 4 or 5 minutes, so 2 or 3 quick questions. Yes.
Yeah, my name is Cam Gula. I'm a senior scientist at a federal agency. A lot of federal agencies have international science and technology programs, and they collaborate with other institutions. What's the best way these agencies can collaborate with each other so that there is more effective science and technology program that assists diplomatic and diplomacy efforts? That's part one. The part two is, how is science diplomacy, as you envision it, being impacted by export control and regulations and those kinds of issues that are, I guess, barriers to this kind of very wonderful activity?
Well, we mentioned the visa thing, and that's been an issue in the movement of people. Export controls can be a really severe problem. And as you know, there was a study in the academy, and it's now been recommended, and President Obama has set up a study group, and they've pledged to try to revise the export control system. It's a very complicated issue, and there will always be people here and people here, and hopefully they'll find some amelioration of that situation. The cooperation among agencies is always a problem, but if you think it's bad here, it's really bad in other countries where the pillars of individual agencies are a big problem. Just keep working on it. AAAS fellows are a wonderful example. If you've got friends in every other agency in town, you've got contacts. That's the way government works.
Do you want to say anything?
No, I would just second what Norm just said about working with across agencies. Those of us who live in Washington know how hard that is. And really the best way to overcome it, I completely agree, my own limited government experience has been through informal relationships.
So let's pose the last 2 questions, and then you guys can respond to them. Sid, do you want to? Yes.
My name's Sid Burback. I'm with the Ashley Square Institute at the University of Texas at Austin. I had a question. Could you comment on the role of commercialization, connecting markets, and wealth creation in science and technology policy? And where is the place, or where's the dialogue with that? What's the impact of including that in the policy?
You know what the hot word is today in the whole thing? The reason I was in Pakistan recently, the hot word is innovation. Everybody in the world wants to innovate now. Now, my definition of innovation is the one we used at TI in the old days, and they still do. It's not an innovation until it's a success in the marketplace. And you folks at IC Squared believe in the same thing. It is very important today, and all of these governments around the world are justifying investment in science because of its future benefit as producing innovative products. both of social value as well as commercial value. It is a very important issue, and interesting, we haven't talked a lot about it with the sort of, I'm just trying to think if we've done very much. We haven't done in our science diplomacy initiatives very much of that, but at the USAID level, at the assistance level, it is a very big deal. And among countries themselves, as you just talk with them about cooperating, innovation is the hot word. I really mean that.
Yeah, in some ways, the private sector is doing science diplomacy better than governments ever will. And, but I think that's why it's so important that Norm's work, which concentrates on bad countries, you know, is the kind of thing that's needed, because these commercial efforts will not, probably not going to affect them.
But thanks for saying that about that companies are so important. You know, if a company goes someplace and, you know, builds a factory and employs 2,000 people and trains people and so on, that has an enormous impact. So companies are very important. And I used to think that when I was in a company, but you tend to forget about it when you're in government. Oftentimes we labor and involve 10 people in something, but if a company does something, they'll involve hundreds or thousands of people. Yeah, it's very important.
Over here, please.
Thanks. Yeah, my name is Sam Heil. I'm an undergrad here. I guess my question would be for the ambassador. You mentioned the importance of teaching English, but I'm curious, as a diplomat, what advice would you give a student, say like myself, who might be interested in going into this kind of field, about the importance of learning the language? For example, would you tell me go out there, learn Chinese, learn Arabic, or would you endorse the alternative view that, you know what, at that level everything's going to be conducted in English, so don't bother?
No, I think you should go out and learn the language. And in fact, it sort of brings us back to Ambassador Dirigian's introduction in the advisory group on public diplomacy for the Arab and Muslim world that Ambassador Dirigian chaired. One of our recommendations was that Arabic teaching especially, but as well as Farsi, sort of strategic languages, Chinese be increased in the State Department. And guess what? It hasn't. And it's a big problem. I mean, the number of people who, when I was at the State Department, who were able to carry on, let's say, a debate on Al Jazeera in Arabic. So it's not just knowledge, but it's knowledge of nuance of language can be counted on not one hand, but probably 2 or 3 fingers. So it is a big problem. It's true that English has become the universal language, and people want to learn English. They want their kids to learn English because they see it as a way to economically advance. And that's why we teach English, why the State Department teaches English or promotes the teaching of English, because it's actually a way to tell America's story in a very unobtrusive way. But I absolutely would tell you to learn a lot. Now, which one? I don't know. But I would start with those 3. Chinese, Arabic, and Farsi. Now, Dr. Newrider speaks, I think, Japanese, German, French, and how many? Russian?
Russian, Polish.
Right,
Yes.
so he missed Chinese so far, but he's going to learn that. He's going to learn that next week, and then Farsi.
Let me tell you, I once said that I'd never visit a country without knowing the language first. That promise went away fairly quickly. But no, go abroad, learn at least one language really well. It will pay off. When I went to college, my father said, I don't care what you major in, do one thing, study Russian. I went to college in 1948. Let me tell you, it paid off for me in a big way.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we're going to have to wrap up, or did you want to?
I just want to add on to what Norm and Jim said to answer your question. Unfortunately, we have a bit of an arrogance in our country that the whole world is speaking English, so that all we have to do is, depend on others to learn our language. But what is fundamental is not only the linguistic ability, but if you learn a foreign language, you are learning a foreign culture. And your ability to work in that culture, understand that culture, and succeed in whatever pursuit you're making is incredibly enhanced. And that's why learning foreign languages is just not a linguistic tool, it's a cultural tool.
As a language student, I
strongly endorse that.
No, that's right. And languages come in families. That's the important thing. If you learn a Romance language, you're not uncomfortable in any of 6 languages. You learn a Slavic language pretty well, you're comfortable in 13 different languages. So, no kidding, they build on each other. Now, I don't have any of the Turkic languages, none Dravidian languages, none of the Sanskrit languages, but there's something to do, right? Right?
So,
you'll never be bored.
Thank you for this wonderful discussion. Thank you, Ambassador, and the Baker Institute, and Neil and Kirsten. To my partners, Kathy and Alexis at PSA, my colleague Beth McCollum, thanks for your help. AAAS, Norm, and our friends back in Washington. Please join me in giving a big round of thanks to our 2 speakers.
Oh, I always.